Hello everyone, I welcome you all to your third semester botany classes. We'll be studying third chapter which is flower and pollination. But let's first understand what flower is, its definition and structure. So let's begin. How we define a flower which is also called as a bloom or a blossom, it's the reproductive structure found in flowering plants. See, a plant has many other parts like it has branches, it has leaves, but it's the flower which carries the reproduction. So it can be defined as the reproductive part in the flowering plants. Flowering plants are also called as angiosperms, or else a plant can also be defined as the modified shoot, which with due course of time has taken the function of reproduction in higher plants. Now coming to the parts of a flower, if we'll take a flower and remove its parts from the front side, we will get a structure like this. Firstly, there is a stalk-like structure, a stick-like structure which supports the flower, which we call as pedicel or flower stalk. Then there is a swollen portion which supports all other floral parts, which we call as receptacle or thalamus or torus. Then there are generally green leaf-like structures which we call as calyx or sepals. Then there are colored parts of a flower, colored leaf-like parts of flower, which we call as petals or corolla. Then there's male reproductive part, which we call as androicium or stamen, and then there is female reproductive part, which is flask shaped, which we call as gynoissue or pistil or carpel. So let's revise. A flower, it has a stalk which we call as pedicel or flower stalk. Then there's a swollen portion which supports the floral parts, which we call as receptacle or thalamus or torus. Then there are generally green structures which we call as sepals or calyx. Then there are colored parts. These can be red, yellow, white, orange, which we call as petals or corolla. Then there is male reproductive part which we call as androicium or stamen, and then there is female reproductive part which we call as gynoissue or pistil or carpel. Generally in a flower we say there are four whorls. First whorl is of sepals or calyx, then there are petals or corolla, then there is androecium or stamen, third whorl, and then there is fourth whorl which we call as gynoecium or pistil or carpel. So let's understand these whorls one by one. First, coming to calyx or sepals. These are generally green in color. This is the outermost whorl of the flower, as I have already said. These are generally green in color, but in some species like in Fuchsia, these can be colored. See, you can see here it's the Fuchsia species which is found in Japan. It's a flower. It has the sepals, but these are not green. These are generally reddish, light reddish or pinkish, you can say. These are the sepals, and its petals are deep purple. Such a condition of calyx, such a condition of the sepals, it's called as petaloid. Here the sepals, we call them as, it's a condition called as petaloid. But remember, here we can easily distinguish between the sepals and petals. We can easily say which are sepals and which are petals. But the sepals here are colored, they are not green, and such sepals we call them as petaloid. Such calyx we call as petaloid. Usually the sepals, as you can see here in this picture, they are protective for the flower in bud condition. They protect the flower when it's in bud condition, and it often supports the petals when it blooms. When the flower blooms, they do support the other whorls. They prevent rapid transpiration from the inner parts of the flower. These petals generally they are very sensitive and to heat and light, to excessive heat and light, and it is these sepals which protect them from excessive transpiration and hence prevent the early withering of the leaves. They may fall immediately after the flower opens. These sepals or calyx, it can fall immediately after the flower opens or may remain attached with the flower and wither when the flower withers. But there are some plants in which the calyx remains even up to the maturation of the fruit, like in tomato and brinjal. See, in tomato and brinjal, you are having green leaf-like structures. This is actually sepals or the calyx of the flower, which has remained persistent up to the maturation of the fruit. So we can say in tomato and brinjal, calyx or sepals are persistent even up to the maturation of the fruit. In some species, calyx not only persists after flowering, but instead of withering, it begins to grow. So when a flower has bloomed, it begins to grow in some species and forms a shield-like enclosure around the fruit or around the flower. This is effective protection against some kinds of birds or insects. This is to protect the flower from the insects or fruit from birds and insects. For example, hibiscus trionum, it's a good example. You can see the fruit of this hibiscus. This is the flower and this is the fruit. When it has matured into the fruit, the sepals, they have grown and covered the shielded the fruit. It is just to prevent the fruit from herbivory. Now coming to another whorls, a second whorl, which we call as petals, or we call them as corolla. These are colored. This is the second whorl of the floral leaves inner to calyx. Petals are variously colored. They can be variously colored. They can be red. They can be violet. They can be yellow. They can be orange. They have wide range of colors. The individual leaf or corolla is called as petal. We call them individually as petal, but collectively we call it as corolla. Like in sepals, we call them individually sepals, but group of sepals it's called as calyx. These are brightly colored, so talking about the petals, they are brightly colored, sometimes fragrant, which makes the flower attractive for pollination by various agents like insects and birds. The petals could produce different scents to allure desirable pollinators. Pollinators can be insects, they can be birds, or repel undesirable pollinators. Sometimes petals in some flowers, they smell bad. It is just to repel the undesirable pollinators, undesirable visitors to the flower. Now additional points about sepals, calyx or petals, corolla. These are the sepals and these are the petals. Sepals and petals are together called as flower envelope or perianth. Together we call them as flower envelope or we call them as perianth. These are considered to be modified leaves. Actually, they are said that they used to be leaves, but with due course of time, they have taken the function of reproduction, they have taken the function, different appearances, and have modified into sepals and petals. These two words are sterile. See, we know a flower is the reproductive part, but if we will see, a flower has four whorls. One is sepals, another is petals, another is androicium, another is gynoissue. These petals and sepals or calyx and corolla, these actually do not participate in the reproduction. In actual, they don't participate in actual reproduction, so these are said to be sterile and are considered as non-essential or accessory whorls or helping whorls. See, another condition is where you are not able to distinguish between the sepals and the petals, wherein there are sepals and there are petals, but you are not able to distinguish between them. Such condition we call as tepals. At that time we call them as tepals. You remember the fuchsia flower? There we call the calyx was petaloid, but we were able to distinguish the petals and sepals. Only difference was petals at that time were differently colored other than green, but they were distinguishable from that of petals. But here in this flower of hellebore, if you can see, the both the petals and sepals, they are green. This is outer world, this is sepals, and this is inner world, this is petals. Both of them are green and are indistinguishable from each other. Here's another example. This is lilium flower. If you can see outer whorl, this is a calyx or sepals, and this inner whorl, it is petals. These two here are indistinguishable, are of same structure, same color, so at this time we call them individually as tepals, tepals, tepals. Now coming to another whorl, third whorl, which is Androicium or stamens, which we know it's the male reproductive part. See, up till now we have seen calyx or sepals, we have seen petals or corolla, but we know that actual they don't participate in the reproduction. They just protect these two internal whorls, and hence they are sterile or are called as non-helping or are called as accessory whorls or helping whorls. Now, this androecium or stamens, it's the male reproductive part of a flower. So let's have a look. This is the third whorl of floral appendage that is inner to corolla. The individual appendage is called stamen. If you will see this, it will be called as stamen, and together we will call them as androecium, and it represents the male reproductive part. So now let's have a look at this stamen. If you will see, it has a thread-like structure which we call as filament, and then it has a lobed structure, generally a lobed structure at its upper end, which we call as anther. Together, anther and filament, they make up stamen. Stamen is the male reproductive part or androecium. Its structure is somewhat like this. It has a long thread-like stalk which we call as filament, and then it is the upper bulb-like portion which we call as anthers. Now if we will give a transverse cut to this anthers like this, here we will see inside of the anther there will be four sac-like structures which we call as pollen sacs, and these pollen sacs carry the pollen grains which we will look in our future lectures. This is the real picture of some flowers showing the anthers and the filaments. Together we call it as stamen. This is the filament, this is the anther. Here also this is the stamen, this is the anther. We call it as stamen, and together we refer it to as androecium. Now coming to another part, important whorl of the plant and the last whorl of the flower, which we call as gynoissue or carpel or pistil. It's somewhat like this in shape. It has parts like this. The upper part, which we call as stigma, then a long tube-like structure which we call as style, then it has the round swollen part which we call as ovary, and inside the ovary there are ovules, and it's referred to as carpel or pistil. Firstly, coming to stigma, it's the receptive spot which lodges the pollen grains, means where the pollen grains are caught. This is the portion where this is the female reproductive part, and this stigma, it's the spot where the pollen grains are taken or lodged. Then we are having style, it's slender like structure which connects stigma with the ovary. Then we are having ovary. It's the basal swollen part of carpel or gynoissue which bears one or several ovules. See, this is the female reproductive part of a flower which we call as gynoissue or carpel, or we call it as pistil. It has parts like stigma. It's the receptive platform wherein the pollen grains are lodged. Then we have style. Then we have ovary swollen part, and inside the ovary we have the ovules, and it's inside these ovules the eggs are formed which represent the female gamete. We'll have look at these also but in future lectures. So let's move. This is the flower showing this receptive stigma here, then it is style, and then this is the ovary with many ovules visible. Here you can also see the stamens or the androecium part. These are the anthers, these are their filaments, and these are the petals, and this is the receptacle or torus or thalamus, and this is the pedicel. Now let's revise. We are having a flower, where in the flower we are having generally first whorl is green, which we call leaf-like structures which we call as sepals, or we together call them as calyx. Then we are having colored parts which we call as petals or corolla. Then there are female parts which we call as stamens or androecium. Stamen has two parts, one is filament, another is anther. Then we are having the female part, which we call as gynoicium or carpel or pistil. It has three parts. One is stigma, the upper part which receives the pollen grains. Then we are having style, and then we are having the ovary. Another important part about this, another important thing about this flower is that it arises in the axil of certain leaves, which we call as bracts. Okay, these are the bracts. These are green leaf-like structure, and it is within this axil the some flowers rise. This is called as bract. The flowers which have these bracts are called as bractate flowers. Now coming to types of flowers. Flowers of two types. One is bisexual flower or perfect flower. Another is unisexual flower or imperfect flower. So let's see what bisexual flower or perfect flower is. Bisexual flower or perfect flower can be defined as the flower which has both Androicium and Gynoissue in one flower. This is perfect flower. Here you can see this flower of hibiscus. You can see this is the female part. You can see its stigmas, they have arisen above, and these are the anthers. So it has both female part and male part in the same flower, which calls such a flower as perfect flower or bisexual flower. Now another category of the flowers is unisexual flowers or imperfect flowers. See, if we will take an example of, for example, papaya. Papaya has two different individuals. One individual carries the female parts, female flower, and another carries the male flowers. Here you can see the female flower of the papaya. It has just the pistils or carpels or gynoicium. It doesn't have any stamens, no anthers are here. So it has only pistils or the female part. So we will call such unisexual flower as pistillate flower. Unisexual flower is the flower which just carries only one reproductive part, either a male or a female. If it carries just carpels or gynoicium or pistils, we call such flower as pistillate flowers. Pistillate flowers are also called as female flowers, and this is the flower of papaya. And then we are having staminate flowers. Staminate flowers are the flowers, unisexual flowers, which have only male reproductive parts, stamens only, and this is the male flower which we call as staminate. This is all about today's lecture. Thank you so very much. Put your questions here. Your questions and suggestions will be welcome.